Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Longtime Bolivian President Evo Morales has departed Bolivia for Mexico after stepping down Sunday in what he calls a military coup. Late Monday, Morales departed La Paz on a Mexican government plane. He's been granted asylum in Mexico. He announced his resignation Sunday, shortly after the Bolivian military took to the airwaves to call for his departure. Last month, Morales was re-elected for a fourth term in a race his opponents claimed was marred by fraud. Morales' departure has sparked outrage and protests across Latin America, with many saying he was the victim of a military coup. This is Danielle Menendez in Argentina.
There have been enormous advances in all social indicators in Bolivia in the past 14 years that bother the privileged sectors, that hydrocarbons have been nationalized, that basic income has been increased for the entire population. Despite all this, a minority, together with the armed forces, are carrying out this outrage, this barbarity that has to do with a coup, and policies that we thought had been eradicated from the region, and that is why it is so important that popular movements throughout Latin America come out to repudiate this coup.
Evo Morales was Bolivia's first indigenous president. On Monday, videos circulated of Morales' opponents burning Wipila indigenous flags. Morales' departure came a week after Bolivia's government canceled a massive multinational lithium mining project slated for Bolivia's southern highlands. To see our coverage of the political crisis in Bolivia, go to democracynow.org. In immigration news, the Supreme Court will begin to hear oral arguments today on 3 lawsuits demanding the Trump administration preserve DACA. That's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the Obama-era program that grants protection from deportation and a work permit to at least 700,000 undocumented people brought to the United States as children. This is 31-year-old DACA recipient Maricruz Abarca.
If the Supreme Court doesn't go in favor of DACA, basically it's going to be just, for me personally, it's just going to be an end. It's like I'm just going to go back to shadows and, not continue my education, pursuing my dream to become a criminal lawyer. The future of thousands of dreamers, and not only dreamers, but American U.S. citizens, are basically in their hands. It's like we are just right there in the limbo, not knowing what's going to happen with our lives.
On Capitol Hill, televised impeachment hearings are slated to begin Wednesday into the inquiry into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son. It's only the 3rd time in U.S. history there have been televised impeachment hearings. On Wednesday, the first 2 witnesses to testify will be George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and Bill Taylor, a former ambassador and the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick may jump into the 2020 presidential race. The New York Times reports the 2-term governor has spoken to Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden and Democratic officials and is considering announcing his plans to run later this week. Deval is managing director at the private equity firm Bain Capital, which was co-founded by Republican Utah Senator Mitt Romney. Here in New York, longtime Republican Congressmember Peter King has announced his retirement. King is the 14-term representative from Long Island. Progressive lawmakers celebrated his announcement that he would not seek election in 2020. Among them, Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who tweeted, quote, "Peter King is an Islamophobe who held McCarthyite hearings targeting American Muslims, said there are too many mosques in this country, and blamed Eric Garner for his own death at the hands of police. Good riddance," Congressmember Ilhan Omar tweeted. In Los Angeles, Donald Trump Jr. was heckled off stage during a talk by his own supporters, who erupted in protest after he announced he would not be taking questions. President Trump's son was at UCLA, the University of California's Los Angeles campus, Sunday to promote his book, Triggered: how the left thrives on hate and wants to silence us. But it turned out to be his own right-wing fans who ended up silencing and driving the author off stage with hostile chants of Q&A, Q&A, to the tune of USA, USA, after Trump Jr. said there would not be enough time for audience questions. The Environmental Protection Agency plans to restrict the scientific research that the federal government uses to write new public health regulations. That's according to the New York Times, which obtained a draft of new EPA proposals that stipulate scientists would have to disclose their raw data, including confidential medical records, in order for the EPA to even consider an academic study's conclusions. Scientists say these measures would make it far more difficult for the agency to issue new clean air and water rules. The Israeli military bombed the home of a senior member of the Palestinian group Islamic Jihad before dawn in Gaza today, killing the commander Baha Abu Elata and his wife Asma and injuring their children. Following the targeted assassination, over 50 rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel, injuring at least one civilian. The European Union has condemned the rocket attack, saying, quote, "The firing of rockets on civilian populations is totally unacceptable and must immediately stop." The Afghan government and the Taliban have agreed on a prisoner exchange, which Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says aims to facilitate direct peace negotiations. The swap will free American professor Kevin King and Australian professor Timothy Weeks. Both had been professors at the American University of Afghanistan before being kidnapped in Kabul in 2016. In exchange, the Afghan government will free 3 senior Taliban members, Anas Haqqani, Hafiz Rashid, and Haji Mali Khan. The Chilean government has agreed to rewrite its constitution in order to replace the one that was written during Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet's brutal military regime. The rewriting of the constitution has been one of the key demands of the massive demonstrations that have rocked Chile in recent weeks. The Chilean authorities have killed at least 19 people and wounded thousands more since the protests erupted on October 19th in response to a subway fare hike and quickly grew into a revolt against austerity and economic inequality. Over 260 people were arrested in Hong Kong Monday amidst escalating clashes between pro-democracy student protesters and police. Some schools and universities across Hong Kong are closed today as demonstrations continue across the territory. Over 3,000 people have been arrested since the protests broke out in June. In Arizona, activist Scott Warren of the group No More Deaths is heading back to court for a second trial today for providing water, food, clean clothes and beds to 2 undocumented migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. Warren's been indicted on felony conspiring to harbor. If convicted, he could spend up to 10 years in prison. A jury deadlocked after his first trial 5 months ago. In August, Democracy Now! Accompanied Scott Warren into the Sonoran Desert of Arizona as he accompanied other activists dropping food and water for migrants attempting the deadly crossing. This is Scott Warren.
So there's the direct impact on people who have died, people who have suffered out here, people who have been disappeared, and then the ripple effects of their families. The trauma that creates, the traumatic experience of this is another way that it can feel like a conflict or like a war zone. I don't like the war zone rhetoric that you typically hear politicians use because it's deployed to increase militarization and building of walls. But it's appropriate when we think about the trauma that people have faced as they cross through these areas and the trauma that their families experience and the pain.
Former President Jimmy Carter is scheduled to undergo an operation today to relieve pressure on his brain. The 95-year-old was hospitalized Monday evening at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The Carter Center said the procedure is needed due to bleeding due to his recent falls. Carter suffered a minor pelvic fracture from a fall last month and broke his hip in a separate fall in May and got stitches in his head as well. Until just a few weeks ago, he was continuing to build homes for his project Habitat for Humanity. And in Texas, the father of Tatiana Jefferson has died, less than 1 month after a police officer killed his 28-year-old daughter by shooting through the bedroom window of her own home in a case that sparked national protest over the treatment of African-American women at the hands of police. On Saturday, Tatiana's father, Marquise Jefferson, died after suffering a heart attack. The family spokesperson said, quote, "I can only sum it up as a broken heart." Tatiana was his only child. She was killed exactly 1 month ago on October 12th by white police officer Aaron Dean, who was responding to a non-emergency wellness check called for by a neighbor who noticed Tatiana had left her front door open. Dean has been charged with murder. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.